Hi, beautiful souls. This is me, Christine, also known here as Shamamahuntingowl. And this is a video talking about the original father wound. And I'm going to be sharing some very, very personal information. I'm going to be super vulnerable. And I'm going to do my best to present this material, this information in a very concise manner. And I hope that Spirit just is with me and allows me the grace to deliver this message to you guys in a way that you will be able to understand it. So thank you guys for being here very much, very, very much. And thank you for the support that you guys have been giving me since I made the last video, and with the things that I'm sharing and the direction that I'm moving to change things around up here a little bit. So I'm going to kind of tell you a little story, but before we get started, I just want us to all just take a really nice deep breath, come into our heart space, and I appreciate you all for being very open to receiving this message. Okay? So, all right, I'm going to tell you a little story. And I'm going to try to make it not heavy, but there are going to be some heavy parts, and there may be some things that trigger some of you. So I just want to say that going in. I'm going to tell you a little story about me. I was born in New York to Italian Catholic, Roman Catholic parents back in the late 60s, okay? My father was the second child in his family, and he was not a wanted pregnancy. And his parents were abusive and very much their feelings about the pregnancy permeated my father's life, his whole life. He was never good enough. His older sister was the shining star, and my father received a lot of abuse and a lot of emotional neglect due to his situation. My mother was the oldest of 5. Again, raised in a very Catholic, both of my parents, very Roman Catholic, Italian families. And my mother's parents were abusive. They were alcoholics. My grandmother was a pill popper. My grandfather drank heavily, heavily, heavily. And my mother, her pregnancy, her conception back in the 1940s, 1947, my grandmother got pregnant before my grandfather and she were married. And my mother, it was always kept a secret, let's put it that way. Nobody knew. It went to such an extreme that my mother actually, still to this day, doesn't know her actual real birth date, because they made sure, back then you were able to alter documents, and they made sure that my mother's birth date was after my grandparents had been married and at least 9 months later. So they made it look like that she was conceived after they were married. That was the way things were done back then. Things were kept secret. There was a lot of shame. There was a lot of judgment. And then there was, of course, the whole Roman Catholic religion that very heavily influenced my family. So when my parents were married, my mother was 18 and my father, I believe, was 21. He had just gotten out of the service. He was had to go to Vietnam. Um, and he was actually discharged prior to being shipped off, because he suffered from night blindness, and he was in the Navy, and they were afraid he was going to walk off a ship or something in the middle of the night. I don't really know, but that was the story I was told. Okay. My mother married my father. Yes, she loved him, but she was escaping her pain, the things that she experienced. And as soon as she graduated high school, my parents got married. And I mean, my mother wasn't even legal drinking age at the time they got married. So on her honeymoon, she wasn't even allowed to have a drink to celebrate. Anyway, so my parents got married. They had me a couple years later. My mother was 21, making my father, 24 at the time. He was working, I don't know, like 3 jobs. And mom got pregnant, and so be it, here I am. I was definitely loved as a child in the best possible way that my parents could love me. But they both had a lot of trauma of their own, and it was never healed. It was never taken care of. So little Christine was born into a very strict, authoritative family who very much believed in the church, God, the Catholic beliefs. I was exposed and taken to church, and always constantly exposed to religious Catholic idols, statues, teachings, my whole life. And so very little Christine, around the age of 3 years old, and I'm going to share with you guys just a couple pictures of who I was then. And yeah, that was me. So cute, right? Anyway, and at about 3 years old, I started seeing things. Not hallucinations, but spirits, demons. They would come to me at night after I was put to bed. And I was terrified, absolutely terrified of the things that were around me that I could see and that I could feel. Now, also, again, my mother was incredibly codependent, and my father was a fucking train wreck. And he did the best he could, but he was very angry and very abusive, physically and emotionally. And as a child, I was not allowed to speak. And I mean in the sense that if something was bothering me, if something was up, I couldn't go to my parents with anything for fear of retribution or what would happen. And so as a young child, I would see these things and I would just, pull the covers over my head and just hide. And I couldn't tell anybody about any of this. And so I kept this secret. And I continued to be exposed to church and religion and Catholicism. And I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought the things that were happening to me made me a bad person, meant that there was something wrong with me, that God didn't love me, that, take a second, hang on guys, sorry, that I was defective, that God had forsaken me. And back then, the Roman Catholic Church was incredibly strict and taught of a God who is vengeful and hateful and was not forgiving. And I definitely thought I was not loved. I never felt safe. I never felt safe in my own house. I never felt safe ever. And again, I kept this secret. And through the years, as I started to grow up, my parents put me in Catholic school because that's what you did. Couldn't send your kids to public school, not from an Italian Catholic neighborhood. It just wasn't allowed. So I started Catholic school. And I learned more about this vengeful, unforgiving God who punished, who, if you made one mistake, you were done with, you were out, that you were cast aside and were condemned. So, needless to say, it was pretty fucking scary. And I was never really taught much about Jesus. Again, in my younger years, we had idols and statues and, crucifixes everywhere. And all I saw was the pain and the suffering that was tied to the Catholic Church. And again, I hid. I didn't tell anybody anything. And around that time, there was a movie called The Exorcist that came out. And that made me lose my shit. Because my grandfather, God rest his soul, allowed me to watch movies like this. Lizzie Borden, The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, things like that at the ripe young age of like 5, 6, 7 years old. And so I saw all of the darkness and was convinced that I was bad, because all of these things that were always happening to me. I would hear voices, I would see demons, I would feel things in such a huge way. Obviously, that was the empathic part, that I could feel other people's stuff. I could feel darkness. I could feel nothing but pain. And I had no one to turn to. And so this sweet little child hid her pain, hid my suffering, hid my physical abuse. I would get, wait till your father comes home. And I was a good kid. Like, this was the thing, like, I was literally a good kid because I was so terrified of the repercussions of what would happen if I did do something wrong. So on the one, on the chance occasion that I didn't get an A and got a B, or, asked a question that I shouldn't have, I was seriously reprimanded and hurt. Now, during this time in church, in school, they didn't really teach us the Bible. We never actually sat with the Bible. We had something called a catechism that taught us about God and told the stories, but we didn't actually like read verses and do all of that. it was more like, and by the way, the Catholic schools I went to were all nuns, okay? All nuns, until I was in about 4th grade, when we moved to Florida. So I held all of this in, and then I was also sexually abused. The first time I was around 5, 6 years old, and it was by my mother's youngest brother, who happened to be around my age. And then it just, other instances and other people who had hurt me from then on in. So I was fucked up. Let's just put it straight out there, right? I was a fucking mess, but nobody knew, because I just smiled and sat in a corner and played with my dolls and did life, and just thought this was how you lived, being raised in New York back then. People were very separated. So we lived in a neighborhood where everybody was either Roman Catholic, Italian, or Jewish. And there were very, very, very few Jewish people, let me just say. So my exposure to people and other religions was incredibly limited. And I had nobody to talk to or really share anything with. So I would just, go about my day and do my things, and always hope that I would do good enough so that I wouldn't get punished in whatever way my father sought or felt was right. And, my mother was no saint in any of this. Like I said, she was codependent. She was raised in a very different time where spanking and hitting and using things like belts and plastic and wooden and metal spoons and things like that was acceptable. I mean, it was just part of the way I grew up and the way most of the people actually that I was friends with grew up. And that eroded this little girl. It took pieces of me away. And I would very much go inside myself and try to escape all of it. But there was never any peace, never any safety. And although my parents would tell me they loved me, their actions spoke much louder than their words. And so I grew up, like I said, incredibly unsafe, and not protected. I mean, I knew they weren't gonna actually kill me, but I knew that had I ever spoken up, that it was going to be really, really bad, much worse than I had it. So I always kept quiet. To the point where one day my mother actually packed my bags and put me in the car and drove me to an orphanage and told me that that's where I was going to go live if I didn't behave and if I didn't do better. Now, I can't even tell you what I might have done wrong, but I knew I felt like I deserved it. And so basically, let's just say my childhood really fucking sucked. Now, I had a few friends on the block that were neighbors, just a couple. Most of my interactions with people were family. We had big family, lots of cousins, and I had quite a few male cousins who were incredibly abusive to me. They would bite me, they would hit me, they would hurt me. And when I would, of course, get injured, I would cry, whatever, and I would get in trouble for crying, for telling, for what did you do to deserve it, kind of a thing. And I was continued to be put back in these situations with the same people that were hurting me on a regular basis, as well as having to deal with the stuff that was going on at home. Now, we had a neighbor, and I'm going somewhere with all of this, so please, follow me and understand. So needless to say, I couldn't turn to church. I couldn't turn to the nuns. I used to get paddled in school. That was in the day when they were even allowed to paddle you in school. And I literally used to get paddled in school by the nuns. And so there was nobody that I could even attempt to connect with on any of this. And then one day we had moved into a new house. I was about 4.5, 5 maybe at the most. And we moved into a new house. And again, same idea, same neighborhood type stuff, Italian Catholic, very strict. Everybody went to Catholic school. We all, walked a mile down to the bus stop together, walked home together. But nobody ever talked. And most of them, I should say, most of my friends experienced the same types of behaviors and experiences with their families. So to me, it wasn't unusual. I mean, it wasn't unusual. It just wasn't. Like, I didn't know anything else, it was that simple. And at the new house, there was a neighbor right next door to us, a beautiful family, very religious, also Catholic. And they had, I want to say, I can't remember if it was 10 or 12 children. And they were I think 10 boys or 11 boys and 1 daughter. And all the kids were older than me, but there was one boy in particular. As a matter of fact, his name was Kevin. And he was about 14, 15 years old at the time. And he became my friend. And for the first time, all right, let me just back up a second. So in Catholic school, we did start to learn about Jesus and a little bit about the New Testament and about, Jesus dying for our sins and his pain and suffering and how he sacrificed for us, for me, for the demons that possessed me, let's say. And so, but I always saw that beautiful side of Jesus, like those picture perfect snapshots of Jesus sitting in the grass, playing with the small children and the little animals. And I want to say idolized that. I always wanted that. There was this crazy, I want to say, attraction, draw to Jesus, but I didn't really understand it. I just knew he had the most gentle, soulful eyes. And it was the only thing that gave me hope every day. But at the same time, because of all of my experiences that I really didn't understand as a child, I questioned and I doubted, because if Jesus was this amazing man, how could I have gone through and be experiencing these things? So once again, I questioned and I was scared. And fear was like should have been my middle name. I was scared of everything. And so going back to the boy, the teenage boy, he was the kindest, sweetest, most gentle human being that I had ever met up until that point. And I could see Jesus in his eyes. That picture perfect vision that I explained before was like my relationship, my friendship that I had with this boy. And he would sit with me on the front porch, and we would talk and play games, and he was just so good and pure. He would lay on the grass with me, and we would play the cloud game and find shapes in the clouds. And I felt like he was my protector. So there's only one other time that I have looked into someone's eyes and felt that connection that I felt to Jesus. And that was when I met my twin. When I first looked into his eyes, I saw Jesus, Yahshua, in his eyes. And so this young man really kind of helped soothe me and helped me find some peace from time to time when he was around to hang out with and play with. So we moved to Florida 2 years later. We were only there a short time, and my dad wanted to move to Florida, and so that we packed up and moved to Florida. And when we moved, we were not the only family on the block to move. Our parents all arranged. There were 4 families that my parents were close to, and all of us moved to Florida together. And again, came to Florida back in Catholic school. The schools here were terrible. I had to go to public school for literally 2 months because we moved toward the end of the year. And the Catholic school that they tried to get me into literally told my parents, we have enough Italian families and we're not accepting your daughter. And so I had to wait until the next school year before I could start Catholic school at a different school that would accept a Catholic Italian family. And during that time, I went to public school, and the school I went to was very, very far from my home. They loaded us on a bus at 6:30 in the morning, and school started at 7:30, and that's how far away it was. And I had my first exposure to Black children, Chinese children, different ethnicities, okay? Different religions. And they taught us all, I was in 3rd grade at the time, and they taught us all in just like one giant collective classroom. And I was so scared, and nobody liked me because I talked funny. I had this really heavy New York, Brooklyn accent. And I was different than everybody else. And so we had more fear and more, not accepting, and I wasn't good enough, and nobody wanted to be my friend, and so on and so forth. And I continued to sink deeper. As we moved to Florida, life got much worse. The abuse with my father, and the emotional neglect from my mother, her complacency got worse. My father had a hard time. He left a great job with the post office union, back in New York. And here he couldn't get a job, and he couldn't make the money he needed to make. And my mother had to go to work. And so I became what they called back then was a latchkey kid. And so I would come home from school and lock the door behind me and be left home alone until both of my parents came home from work later that night. And I was left to kind of fend for myself. And so, and I continued to try once when I went to my new school to speak to one of the teachers Now, the beauty of this Catholic school was there were no nuns, and I was so grateful for that, and they weren't allowed to paddle, and that was a fucking godsend in and of itself. And I did try once to talk to one of the teachers who I felt safer with about the things, but she was also raised in a very Italian Catholic home, and she herself would abuse her children. And I would explain about my father's alcoholism and his drinking and, you know, the drugs that started coming into all of that time and era. Now we're talking like, you know, late 70s, early 80s. And she didn't, you know, there was nothing. There was no, this is terrible. Oh my God, we're going to fix this. We're going to help. It was just like, we don't talk about this. And I've just kept my mouth shut and continued. Now, by this point, I had shut down a lot of the demonic things that I was seeing. I was in such a dark place myself. I don't think I would have recognized it because everyone around me, I felt their darkness and I saw the evil. And so I just kind of got used to it, I guess. Disassociated from a lot of it. Like I literally, like I said, I fragmented myself. And I shut down and I compartmentalized and I did all of those things just to survive. Now, the sexual abuse continued, the physical abuse continued. There were other people who had come in and hurt me and things like that. And now I'm growing up and dealing with this. And now at a young age, I started to become sexually active. I was trying desperately to find something to take away my pain. I was searching for a safe place where I could feel protected, but I never found that. So I grew up and I became the Catholic schoolgirl who was the naughty Catholic schoolgirl. I was all prim and proper in my uniform during the day, but I was getting into trouble and I was drinking and I started smoking at like age 11. I tried drugs for the first time around age 11, 12. And I was a wild child. But not too, like I was wild, but I kept it to the point where my parents would never find out. So I had drawn an invisible line for myself about how far was too far. And all of the signs were there. I literally, as a teenager, and I'm talking like 13, 14 years old, because I started high school when I was 13. 13. And I had in my room like liquor bottles, empty liquor bottles, and empty cigarette packs, and pictures of marijuana sensibilia on the walls, and none of this ever like clicked with my parents. I used to smoke in my bedroom, but my parents were also smokers, so they never smelt it. And so this is how I lived my life. And continued to go to Catholic school all the way through to high school, finished high school, you know, through Catholic school. And I began to question. I was that kid in religion class who would ask the questions that nobody else wanted to ask, but everybody was like thinking, you know, and would get in trouble and sent to the dean's office and, you know, blah, 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 blah. Christine mouthed off again. And then I would go home and reap the ramifications of all of that. Because ours was not to question why. What was that saying? Yours is not to question why. Yours was just to do or die. And that's how I lived my life. Went from boyfriend to boyfriend to boyfriend to boyfriend. Started having actual sexual intercourse at age 14. It was pretty fucked up. It was pretty bad. But again, not bad enough that anybody really noticed. And my parents had gone through, over the course of these years, from the time we moved to Florida, uh, separations. My dad was becoming increasingly violent, with now my mother, and abusive with her. And they separated, they got back together, they separated, they got, because again, Catholic religion, you don't get divorced, you know, it's a sin, you can't do that shit. Um, and I was doing my thing, right? I got into tarot when I was about 13 years old, I guess, maybe. Maybe even a little younger. I bought myself my first tarot deck because I was finally ready to start trying to find answers on my own. And tarot is where I started. And I still have that first deck actually right here, you guys. This was the first deck I bought myself. I was about 12 or 13, and began diving into all of the mystical, religious, spiritual things. And again, in secret, nobody knew. So fast forward, I am a very wounded, broken soul. And I meet my husband in college, okay? And fall madly in love and self-sabotaged the fuck out of that relationship because I never felt safe. I never felt truly loved. I never truly felt enough to be with anybody. And so there was always, I always did things to doubt him. And I am as much to blame for our marriage falling apart as he was. But I did what I was supposed to do, right? Like I met this man my second year of college. We fell in love. You know, we went off to law school. He went to law school. We moved out there together. We graduated undergrad. You know, we did all the things like you were supposed to, right? And we got married and we had our kids. Anyway, and I am so grateful and thankful for my two beautiful children that I have from my marriage. Anyway, why am I sharing all of this with you, right? I needed to give you this background so you can understand what has happened over the last week or so. I had tons of suppressed anger, repressed anger. I could not connect with myself. I didn't know who I was. I became very codependent with my ex-husband, who I will not call him a narcissist because he had his own wounds, but he exhibited a lot of narcissistic behaviors with me. He was never physically abusive with me, emotionally abusive, very much so. If I made one mistake, it was pointed out to me. All of my good things that I could have done were never even acknowledged. But if I did one thing wrong, you better sure know I knew about it. And again, I lived thinking that this is what marriage was. It's what was modeled for me the whole time. And I believed in God, but I didn't really have a relationship with God. And I was still seeking stuff. Okay, where do I want to go with this? Okay, so my divorce happens. We separate, we get divorced. It took, now we're up to 2007 already. And my marriage is falling apart. It's a fucking farce. My ex-husband had chose to be with a much younger woman that he was having an affair with. So we separated, got divorced. I met someone shortly thereafter, and I literally went from the frying pan into the fire. And as wounded and as damaged as I was coming out of my divorce with my ex-husband, this other person who I was with for 5.5 years finished me off, completely broke me to my core. There was nothing left of who I was. He was a sex addict. He was doing things and not just watching porn. This was not just a porn addiction. This was a full-blown sex addiction. He came from a very, very, very traumatic childhood, a very abusive, I mean, even more so abusive than my childhood was. And I had great empathy. Now, mind you, I had gone to college for psychology. I have my master's in mental health counseling. And I was convinced that I could fix him. I could help him. I could make him be a better man. Mind you, all the time I didn't know about any of the sex addiction at that point. Sex addiction was something that was just starting to be heard of and known of. We had gone to therapy he and I, for several years. The therapist, and I would tell the therapist these things that I was finding and seeing and and that he was doing, and the therapist never even made the connection with sex addiction. And so boom, that relationship explodes. And right before that is when I met the person who you guys know as my twin flame. We met because he worked with that boyfriend that I had been living with. And although we had never although we had never met in person, he and I had spoken a few times. We were Facebook friends, blah, blah, blah. He was a married dude. I didn't fucking give it any peace of mind. I was wrapped up in my own shit. But in the fire service, there is a brotherhood. And when my boyfriend at the time got caught doing something by the police that he shouldn't have been doing, his job laid him off, put him on suspension, and sent him into rehab for his sex addiction. And he was sent away for, I want to say like 4.5 months to a treatment center in Mississippi. During this time, the brotherhood would check up on me. They knew I was alone. They understood what was going on. They wanted to make sure I was okay. And at the same time, I started getting very sick. Sick meaning that I was 120 pounds when this whole thing started to blow up. And by the time he came back home after rehab and all of that and treatment, I was down to not even 80 pounds. We attempted, and again, I was going to doctors. Nobody could find anything wrong with me. I was depressed. I was this, I was that. I was put on medications for depression, anxiety. So I began just popping Xanax like crazy, and Wellbutrin, and this fucking antidepressant and that antidepressant. And it did work for a little while. But then it stopped working because my body was literally shutting down. And I took my partner back from rehab because he was committed to working the program. And as soon as he got home, he began to not work the program. And at that same time, 2 weeks after he came home, I found out I had cancer. I had kidney cancer. I was then literally taken into surgery and had my kidney removed. And while the first night of having the surgery, I was in ICU, and my boyfriend came to see me, and he was dressed really nice. And I knew, and he couldn't stay with me. He just came to check in, and he was like out the door, and I knew. So as soon as I recovered and was well enough from that surgery, which took about a month before I was able to be back on my feet and be able to take care of my kids, because my kids were young at this point. My kids were, God, I think they were maybe like 10 and 14, maybe around there. So they needed to be driven places, stuff like that, blah, blah, blah. And so I needed him there. I needed him there to help me But as the day I was ready, the day the doctor said you're okay, he was gone. I let him go. I freed myself. I freed my kids. Now, not that he was a bad man to my children. He didn't really he was very hard on my son, but he loved my daughter very much. And he was overall, again, that abusive mindset. He wasn't that bad until he was, or until I found out he was. And so I cut myself free. Now, during the time he was in treatment, I began to find God again. I began to awaken. I began to experience a different God. And I became what I would call very Christian. Now, not like Bible bashing Christian, not like up on the pulpit kind of Christian, but I became Christian because Jesus was gentle and Jesus was kind. And I saw and felt what that felt like in that friend that I had back in the day. And I was seeking that. I was looking for that. I was trying to make myself a better person. I was trying to repent for my sins, for the things that I thought I had done wrong. And that was my course of coming into this. I also equate this, obviously, to my beloved coming into my field of experience. And like I said, we hadn't met at that point. I had never seen him face to face. Anyway. Okay. I know this is really long, guys, and I appreciate you guys for sticking here with me through this. So we're going to fast forward. So the Christian thing worked for a little while, but I still had this very heavy darkness. And I don't know if I said this earlier, but even when I would go to church, I would cry. From the minute you brought me into church, I would cry, or I would try to hold my tears back so nobody would see me, because I could feel everybody's pain. They were being judged as sinners. They were being judged as bad, as needing to repent. And again, that vengeful God of it was just, it never felt good. And so I tried to get more involved with the church. I said, well, let me try to get more involved, and maybe that's where I'll find my peace, and maybe that's where I'll get my answers. I did Bible study. I tried to talk to the pastor. The pastor wouldn't even fucking talk to me. It was just not a good place. And so I stopped practicing that too. And I knew I had to get my shit together, and I had to figure out what was going on. And I began to try to explore and look into myself. Again, I was beginning to awaken. And I started seeking outside sources. At the same time, I went to massage school. And when I started massage school, everything came back to me. The visions, this connection that I couldn't explain to spirit, to something greater than me, which I would not call God at the time, started to come back. And as you know, when you start this journey, people start coming in and out of your life that are helpers, are soulmates, to guide you, to help you find your direction. And in massage school, I was probably one of the worst in my class, because every time I would touch a body, I would feel their soul. I would feel things that weren't just a knot in a muscle that needed to be rubbed out. And so, I sucked it up, and I kept my mouth shut, and again, kept my mouth shut, and just did what I was there to do. And I took some Reiki, sort of my Reiki courses, and got certified in Reiki 1 and 2, and began to explore that. And that was the way I found myself again. Again, fast forward a little more, I'm in the middle of massage school, and that is when I finally met my beloved in person for the first time. Now, over this period from about 2012 the end of 2012 until the beginning of 2015, we would occasionally just chat, you know, hey, how are you doing? Just checking in, blah, blah, blah. And I would frequently come into passing him places. Like he would see me on the road in a place that I shouldn't have been or was like far from where I normally would be. And he'd be like, did I just see you? And I would do the same thing. And I'm like, yeah, I just left there. Well, I'm just going there. And it was very like that, you know? But finally in 2015, I met him. And in person, he came to my house. He was going to be my first guinea pig in actually doing a massage. I needed to do it for school. I needed a certain amount of people I had to do privately. And he was one of the first ones that came to me. And the moment that man walked in the door, like I said, something happened to me. And I could see that Jesus, that kind, beautiful, pure soul, that safety that I hadn't felt since I was a little girl from that friend Kevin. Anyway, that is not the point of this story, but I just needed to get us there, okay? Now, last week, I was in a lot of shit, as you guys know. I was definitely had a mustard seed of faith. There was no doubt. But a lot of bad shit was going on, and I was feeling really lost. And a beautiful member of our tribe reached out to me last Tuesday and spoke to me. And we talked a little bit about God, and he suggested, very lovingly suggested, that the next day I take a day off of everything. Be in silence, not speak, meditate, fast, and pray. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, okay. And he also gave me a mantra to say. And and he gave me the mantra first as, I am protected, I am loved, and I am safe. Abundance and prosperity are my birthright. And he told me to sit with God in complete silence. And when he gave me the mantra and I said it back to him, I could say I was loved, I could say I was protected, but I couldn't say I was safe. And so he recommended, and without bawling my eyes out and feeling just so not safe and so scared. And so he had me reorder the words, and I am safe, I am protected, and I am loved was the order I was to do this mantra and pray and sit with God in complete silence and fast and do these things. And it just so happened that that was on Ash Wednesday, which was also Valentine's Day. And so I thanked him from all of my being, and I sat with what he had suggested, and it resonated. It resonated within me, because I won't just do something because somebody tells me to do it. It needs to really, truly like resonate in my heart, in my soul. And it did. And so I did this. First of all, fasting sucks. Let me just tell you. That was the suckiest fucking 24 hours of my life. I was literally up until midnight just so I could eat something after midnight. Anyway, so, which is what brings me to you all here today, and this father wound, and the original father wound. The fact that in those moments on last Wednesday that I could turn to God, that I could turn to Jesus, that I could read the Bible. I was at the point where this girl was Catholic school my whole fucking life, and I couldn't even pray. I could be thankful. I could thank God for the things that were happening. I could ask God to please help me. I would see little miracles in my life happen, and I would be grateful and thankful. but this deep, deep, deep connection to God still terrified me up until last week. So as I was sitting in this complete isolation of myself with God, I had a vision, and it was a very confusing and scary vision, because I could see Jesus as my beloved. And I don't necessarily mean my other person, my twin. I literally mean as my true, what's the word they say in the Bible? Bridegroom, and love. And I desired to be close with him in a way that felt inappropriate, because he's like God. He's like my brother. Jesus, like father, son, like I'm a daughter of God. He's a son of God. Like it felt very, very bad. And I was having a really, really difficult time with what I was experiencing, because my heart was just so overcome and overwhelmed with the love and the attraction that I was feeling toward him, toward Jesus. And at one point during this whole thing that I was going through, I saw God. Okay, now yeah, God, I saw God. I literally saw what has always been depicted to me as God the Father. And I saw myself as this little girl, right? This little kid, sweet little innocent child, right? And he just kept holding his hand out to me. He was sitting on the floor, and he kept holding his hand out to me. And he wanted me to come sit in his lap. And I was so scared, you guys, so terrified, that I literally crawled into his lap. And I was so afraid that he was going to hurt me. And I had to let that go. As I sat in his lap, like a scared, beaten dog, Jesus sat in front of us. And he just kept telling me, don't worry, you're okay. You're safe. You are protected. And you are loved. That this was not something that I had done to deserve any of this. That I wasn't needing to be fearful anymore. And it took me a really long time, sitting curled up in God's lap, to even allow him to touch me. Because like, if you visualize a little girl curled up in somebody's lap, and he kept trying to touch me, and I would do this because I was afraid. I would be smited. He would hurt me. Something bad would happen. But as long as I kept my eyes on Jesus and listened to his voice, I knew I was safe, I was protected, and I was loved. And so this went on for hours, that I was going through this, trying to release the fear, release the trauma, allowing my little girl to be held and loved in a safe and beautiful way. And that night, I felt at peace. I repented for the things, and repented sounds like such a big word. And again, it's that very like, oh, you have to repent kind of thing. But I asked God for his forgiveness. I mean, for fuck's sake, I had probably broken more than half of the commandments on the fucking tablets, you know, at that point in my life. And I knew that I was accepting accountability and responsibility for the choices and decisions I made, even if they came from a broken place, and I was offering that up. So using the word repentance sounds just really kind of like ugh and harsh. Anyway, and as I was sitting there with Jesus and God, I was shown my whole history, my path that I had taken, and the things that had happened, and how everything that I equated being a father with, including God, was always violent, never enough, all of those things. I could see the pattern that was laid out before me. And so I sat with all of that, and I worked on releasing it. I worked on healing it. I processed and processed and processed so much, you guys. And finally, like I said, I came to a place of peace within myself, within God's lap, with Jesus there with me, and understanding that God the Father was my father, and the abuse and all of the things I feared were all right there in front of me. And it also brought me to a place where I then understood why it was that I saw Jesus in my beloved Twinflame's eyes. Because the one thing about that man is that I admired him because he was such an amazing father. He had a daughter at the time when we had met, and he was the most proud, most devoted, most loving man to his little girl that I had ever experienced in my fucking life, okay? And that drew me to him, made me love him so much more. I always felt safe with him and protected with him. And that was actually the inspiration of the book that I had written. He was the daddy I never had. He was the man who inspired me, who helped create that memory, that glimpse of safety again. And that's the one thing that I can say to this day that I adore about this man, is his devotion to his little girl, who is now a big girl. I think she's about 12 years old now. Yeah, almost 13. But anyway, I digress for a moment. So where am I going with all of this? This is the journey. This is our process. I found my way back to myself. I have, since all of this, now I don't even know if I said this earlier, but for the last 2 years, I haven't spoken to my father, or no, about a year and a half, something like that. I haven't spoken to my father. In one of my deepest hour of needs last year, I had reached out to him for some help with something, and he outright denied me, would not help me, didn't care, had no interest. So at that point, I needed to cut anyone out of my life, I felt like, that wasn't there for me, that couldn't be supportive of me. And I ceased and desist all contact with my father at that point. Since last week, I have reconciled that relationship with my father. I have accepted him for who he is. I have claimed my part in that of the relationship and the things that I had done, the things that I had done wrong, like literally blowing up at him on the phone and never speaking to him for a year and a half. And I apologized for all those things. Because I needed to clear that energy. I needed to let go of the pain and the suffering and the anger and the unforgiveness that I was holding on to. And actually that all happened this morning with my father. Last night before I went to bed, I was guided to pull some cards for myself before I went to sleep. And I used the Past Life Oracle deck, and forgiveness and trust and faith is what came out. So I meditated on those cards last night. And when I went to bed, I began hearing God's voice tell me that I needed to take this step. I needed to not just heal my relationship with God, but I needed to at least make right what I had wronged. Whether or not my father would accept responsibility, apologize, anything, that doesn't matter. But I needed to finally release and let go of this traumatic pattern that I have experienced with all the men in my life. And so I went through my own process and ritual during the night, and I, worked with the Ho'oponopono Ono prayer, and I asked for forgiveness. And then this morning I messaged my father, and we spoke. And as I, kind of expected, there was no apology, but there was forgiveness. And we didn't actually discuss any details about what had happened, but just that it was water under the bridge, life is short, and I was forgiven and move on. And that was okay. I was okay with that because I understand that my father is a very, very, very wounded adult child who has never been able to connect to his emotions, to his feelings, or let alone verbalize them, unless it was through anger. So why do I share this? I share this with you because I feel like it's really important that we look at all of ourselves, and see the things that have shaped us, have chipped away. I shouldn't even say shaped us, have chipped away at who we were. And I'm sharing this so if any of this resonates and you choose to sit in ceremony with God and Jesus and your persecutor, shall we say, in forgiveness, in true forgiveness, not just like the mental forgiveness. See, that's the thing, you guys. I understood this stuff logically in my head, but what actually happened was I made the connection finally from my head to my heart. I now didn't just have to intellectualize it and just say my dad was a wounded child and he didn't mean what he did and he didn't know better, but I truly felt it for the first time in my heart. And so this is why I share this. So I ask you all to come back to yourselves, to come back to who you were before all the parts of you were chipped away. And I know we've been doing this healing journey for a long time, and I have healed so much. My mother and I relationship is actually doing phenomenal. I mean, she still makes me crazy sometimes, but don't we all? And but we are doing super phenomenal, and my life is better. I feel a transformation. I feel a shift. I feel the lightness. I see the light again in a way that I've never experienced it before. So I guess I'm gonna end this here for now. I do have more to share, but we're already over an hour, and I think that'll be part of another video because there's still some parts of it that I'm processing and I'm not necessarily prepared to speak on yet. So I just want to say, thank you for being here for all this time with me. And thank you for listening, and thank you for your non-judgment. And I appreciate you all so much. And I guess I just want to say that do the work. Look inside yourself. Where are you still holding unforgiveness? Where are you still needing to be forgiven, forgiving yourself, forgiving others? and really making that head to heart to soul connection with all of it. So you guys, with that, I am sending you all so much love and light, gratitude and blessings, always beautiful souls. I love you guys so much. Mwah. I love you, and we'll talk again soon.